Hello, explorers. It's time to continue our adventure of There's an Owl in the Shower. Chapter 2 Enrique. Borden leaned against a young fir tree and recalled the owl hanging from the lamppost. It had bright white spots and walnut brown feathers, easy to identify. He smiled. He was a good shot. A woodpecker drilled to his left. He listened to the rapid hammering. Overhead, a small flock of golden-crowned kinglets sang a series of thin, wiry notes, then chattered softly. Borden thought their voices sounded more like the wind brushing the needles than birdsong. He wanted to look at them, but dared not. He must keep his eyes on the nest. "Owl," he said aloud, "come on out. I know you're in there. My pop showed me your nest last year. He said the cutters call you Enrique. You took my pop's job. Well, I'm going to fix that." He could not say more. The words coming out were crinkled with emotion. A black-tailed deer got to her feet in the grove of ferns. She saw Borden and stood tree still. Gingerly she sniffed the air, then caught the scent of him and bolted. Borden turned in time to see her vanish into a swatch of rhododendrons. Borden looked back at the nest and fingered the trigger on his gun. Some distance away, in a Douglas fir at the edge of the logging road, an owl awoke. He was red-brown from head to toe, chunky, and about 1.5 feet tall. He looked more like a redwood stump than an owl. The owl shook, and a cloud of dust from the logging road puffed out from him. He shook again. Another cloud appeared, and then one more. When the dust was gone, there sat a beautiful spotted owl. He was reminiscent of the stars in a midnight sky. 2 black holes were his eyes. Around his face, dark feathers formed a heart-shaped disc that swept sound to his ears. White eyebrows reflected light into his eyes. He was Enrique, devoted father, great hunter, and one of the few remaining northern spotted owls. He turned his head slowly from side to side, not so much to see, but to listen. Then he ran his beak down the rachis, or hollow barrel, of a wing feather. He pulled it far back and let go. It snapped into place noiselessly. Soft edges along this and all his flight feathers muted their sound. He flew in silence. Enrique swung his head back and forth, then up and down, as he listened to the music of the forest. One ear was lower than the other, giving him sound vision sharper than an eagle's eyes. He heard crickets and twittering birds, and finally, by turning his head, he heard his highway through the tree limbs. Spreading his wings, Enrique soared off, maneuvering among the twigs and branches by sound. Borden heard nothing as Enrique passed overhead and alighted on a limb above the nest. "Hoo, hoo, hoo, hoo," the bird called to his mate. She was brooding their 2 owlets in the deep center of the stick nest that had been built years ago by a hawk and taken over by Enrique and his mate of many years. Borden clicked off the safety on his rifle. That small sound reached Enrique. The spotted owl is required to have ears that are eyes. Enrique lived high in the forest canopy and hunted for creatures who romped in the fog and the mist more than 100 feet below. He saw Borden through that click, then brought him into focus with his eyes and sat still. Borden circled the tree, peering into the high limbs. After a brief search, he saw the roundish owl shape. Quickly, he aimed, holding his breath so he would not jerk when he pulled the trigger. Then, for some reason, he hesitated, and in that instant, the owl faded from sight. It was too dark. "Nuts," he said. He climbed slowly up the steep ravine in the darkness and found his bike. Wheeling it out onto the road, he turned and looked into the gray-black owl grove. "I'll be back," he said. He wheeled off down the mountain road toward his home in the lumber town of Fresta on the Trinity River. The town was 30 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean and in the Trinity National Forest. Enrique listened until Borden rounded the bend and sped away. The gunman gone, he concentrated on finding food. He rotated his head almost all the way over his back. His ears were tapping into the sound waves from flying squirrels, deer mice, and wood rats. Enrique could also hear the gap in the forest where a group of ancient Douglas firs and incense cedars had been cut down by Borden's father and his crew. The empty space whistled and whined. From a distance came a vaster sound. It was created by the treeless north side of the mountain. The cutters had clear cut here, sawing down every tree, big, small, until the mountainside was bare. With them went Enrique's hunting perches and food supply. He was forced to search farther from home. He was wide awake now. He floated down to the limb beside his nest and called softly. 2 owlets thrust their heads out from under their mother's wings and screamed. Their raspy hunger calls drove Enrique onto his wings, and he flew off to hunt for them. Enrique had to feed not only the owlets, but also his mate. She could not leave their young. They had recently hatched and were scantily feathered. At the top of the giant trees, the air was either too cold or too hot for the owlets. The females stayed with them for at least 2 weeks after their hatching to brood and regulate their body temperatures. Enrique alighted on the branch of an ancient Douglas fir 4 miles away. It stood in several hundred acres of old-growth forest, part of his 5 square miles of home range. The flying squirrels were plentiful here. Enrique lifted the feathers over his ears and let in the sounds. He heard barred owl nestlings snapping their beaks in the hollow of the tree where he sat. Then, like a sword-edged wind, the mother barred owl rocketed down upon him. Talons spread, she boomed her tiger call. Barred owls look very much like spotted owls with their solid black eyes and pale horizontal markings, and are often confused with them. They are more aggressive than spotted owls, however, and take over their trees and home range. Chainsaws and barred owls were making Enrique's task of providing food for his family very difficult. Enrique took off. He soared over a clear-cut mountainside to another old-growth forest, where he caught a flying squirrel. He carried it back to his mate to share with the owlets. He returned the long distance and hunted until dawn. He caught only 1 more squirrel. The owlets were still calling for food when daylight sent him back to his roost above the logging road. At sunrise, the huge logging trucks rolled up the mountain and passed through the public lands where Enrique lived. They were on their way to the privately owned forests of the logging companies. These forests were managed by their owners to produce crops of trees in the same way farmers raise wheat and corn. The trees were cut and seedlings planted. Some 75 years in the future, they would be harvested. The logging ban did not apply, in private forests. The trucks passed below Enrique, stirring up dust, and by noon he looked like a redwood stump again. Poor Enrique. And poor Borden. I'm looking forward to reading chapter 3 tomorrow. Have a good evening.